Thanks very much. That's great. Thanks for the introduction. Of course, learn that we have connections with some of our colleagues, and that will be part of my introduction as well. So thanks a lot, everyone, for coming. Can everyone hear me okay? I start to talk really loud. I often don't hear well enough how loud I am, so if I'm really blowing out your ears, you can tell me to talk softly. I'm usually the one that you have to tell to talk softly, not to speak up. So let me just get started. I'm going to really just take some steps through how climate refugees are understood in the international policy, not necessarily out of the Paris Accord, but in comparison to what we would call political refugees. And I want to walk through a couple of points on environmental justice, and then I'll take on some cases. And some of you may have read a piece that I had shared. A few of those cases will turn up. If you want to use this slide presentation, then this is something of the outline of what's actually in the presentation. So that's just your table of contents. What I would like to be able to do is somehow make it through this presentation to the point of actually talking about things like transformative and transitional justice, and how we here in Oregon may actually think about this, even though many of the cases are on the other side of the Pacific, for instance. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is bring out some terms. As a philosopher, I get to invent terms or work out concepts, and these are concepts that have worked out of my research of the last 30 years working in environmental justice, and I've worked to really try to create something of a lexicon, a vocabulary that can tell us about what kind of justice we're actually talking about when we're talking about environmental justice and climate justice. And as I said, about 2 decades ago, what I thought to do would be not try to figure out what kind of social justice is environmental justice, but to rethink the whole rationality of how we do justice. And again, philosophers get to do that and still, I guess, eat or get paid. So the standard that we often see is a framework of distributive justice, where we would see something like this in climate issues is someone might be displaced, relocated, and there might be, since burdens have been distributed to those people, perhaps unjustly, just so happens that they live at a place where climate impacts them faster than other places. We have displacement, and then we may compensate or relocate with some kind of provisions. That might be an ideal for redistributing people in the way that we distribute goods. And that's often the basic notion of social justice, is somehow we achieve equity. But when you start redistributing people from one place to another and then talking about compensation, there's a lot of values that aren't being covered. And since the 19th century, roughly, we've been pushing on a different dimension of justice, recognition justice. And the idea here is it's not just a matter of what we distribute, but who determines what to distribute. And that who is already in a place of power to judge who is likely to get something compared to someone else. And what we would strive for is to have more people recognized in that position of deciding what values we're really trying to preserve and how we determine distribution, as well as how we determine what are the critical elements of power that are going on within society. So they're just simply things that the distributive justice model can't handle, and is actually could be limited to the extent where it creates greater injustices on the recognition side of things, because a top-down distribution system doesn't necessarily recognize the threats and the impacts that a culture or a people or a future may look like. So we'll talk more about that, but two concepts that I've used in the recognition paradigm of justice is looking at the people in environmental justice issues towards an environmental identity and towards their environmental heritage. So the environmental identity, I'll describe further, but I try to make it as maybe radical as to replace the concept of personal identity. So as a philosopher, I could go into a long diatribe about how personal identity is in some ways so ultra-individualized and perhaps presumes a lot about the sort of competitive and individual self-interest of a self against others, that it may actually be more of a contributor to our own self-concepts, to problems that we have, rather than a benefit to how we flourish as people. Whereas an environmental identity, instead of a personal identity, would allow for far more relations between people and far more interactions considering their environment. And their environment is the built and the human, as well as the non-human interaction. There's not an assumption that one stops and another one begins. Lastly, this is standard, right? And then lastly, I want to make a point about restorative justice, ways in which people reconcile with trauma, and in this case, environmental trauma. Reconcile with people who have benefited or privileged, or reconcile themselves to a new situation. More of this will come out as we go further. It's just a few things to note here. No matter how much I cover here, it will only be a brief, one small dimension of the many parts of environmental justice. But I want to make sure that we're seeing that embodiment is really important, the political embodiment, the culture and the life ways of people are considered in the discussion, that we're operating on socio-environmental elements. So we're not really trying to decipher anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric contexts. I would suggest that that might be a problematic division. And that division, instead of having dualist attitudes towards the substance or the character, more perspectival dualism allows us to think about multiple dimensions of justice at the same time. The relational ethics, rather than a competitive self-interest ethics, which often emerges out of a pluralistic politic for distributive justice, is now far more relational, which means we need to interact with different subjects, not as a means to win out in a competitive pluralistic interest, but really to win out in our collective interests. Whatever else we call environmental justice as a movement, there's still some basic elements, but when we do climate refugees and climate justice, we are dealing with so many scales. There's transscalar and multiscalar, which transscalar meaning that that actually the geography starts to change in different places. So it's not just how far away is somebody spatially, but also how do they perceive themselves culturally with reference to others around the world. Some people may be extremely isolationist, some people may have very little power, and mobility, and others may have great power and mobility. So moving forward, the typical political notion of refugee, you may know from 1951 convention, UN convention, it's the vital part is to say that this refugee would be outside of his or her homeland, unwilling or unable to return due to prosecution on account of ethnicity, religion, political belief, gender, or membership in a particular group. So this is taken right out of the UN Convention. And these are some relocated folks who have gone through the political asylum and refugee program, and they have permitted this photograph. Now, in the same convention, there is an account of environmentally displaced people, but they don't stand to the same political characterization that we find in the standard notion of refugees, those we find in refugee warehouses throughout the world, looking for asylum throughout the world. So there was an attempt here where they opted to use the term environmentally displaced persons, defined as persons who are displaced within their own country of habitual residence or who have crossed an international border and for whom environmental degradation, deterioration, or destruction is a major cause of their displacement, although not necessarily the sole one. So we did have, since the 50s, a language to try to discuss environmental displacement, but it wasn't considered something that would render you the refugee status of political displacement or fear of your life, fear because of your identity, unable to return. You're unable to return because maybe the land's not there, or because something has environmentally changed, you've been displaced, it's recognized that you've been displaced, but there's no political operation after that. There's no convention that says, and this is where you will go, and this is how we will serve you, and here are the steps towards asylum, towards your new place. So if you don't have those things in place, how do you relocate? Who's going to let you relocate from where you have to leave? If you're not going to be along the asylum, then we really don't have all the policies in place to accommodate environmental displacement, even though we've been recording it in these documents since the 50s. Now, if we shift to climate refugees, much more of a political concept where something has been done through probably extensive anthropogenic processes that makes the environmental condition worsened and accelerated. So in this case, the relocation process and the displacement process happens much faster along the lines of what we might think as natural disasters when it's an intense storm, but not the kind of thing where the sea is going to recede to its original place. The seas are rising in this case, so we're going to have more difficulty stopping the next rise or the next increase. So a person displaced by climatically induced environmental disasters, and such disasters result from the incremental rapid ecological change, resulting in increased droughts, desertification, etc., what we've seen in many places today, and probably yesterday, day before. These are places that just keep pouring through. This is a common quote and a common number that we see. It has been for about 10 years the way that the numbers have been constructed, which means that they're probably not accurate any longer. So we're looking at about 250 million increase in climate refugees, to rise to 250 million. And we're working on these as conservative numbers because science itself has to operate conservatively with the data points that it feels assured are real evidence for changes in climate, changes in the environment. So if we're working with climate science, then we're getting probably the numbers off. And this is something that's been predicted, and we now are seeing a number of authors recognize this. So I want to just point out real quickly that if we think about climate refugees, again, we have a number of things that are lacking in comparison to political refugees. You don't really have an international agency working to this. We have some agreements, but we don't really have something like the UN with climate refugees. There's no strong resources that's coming from the international community as a whole to work through the aid that's necessary for climate refugees. And there's a lot of times where even if you satisfy by compensation, the mitigating strategies seem to be lacking. If you're working now from environmental justice, the actual distinction between political and environmental itself is a false distinction. So if the distinction is political refugees versus environmental refugees, conceptually from an environmental justice standpoint, that's an arbitrary distinction. And there's few enough resources for what we're calling political refugees. If you added climate refugees of those numbers, there would be even that much less resources for all the people that deserve to be counted. So that's part of the crisis, is holding back certain terms and policies and recognition for certain peoples, because the resources needed to handle the real numbers are far more than people are willing to shell out. Okay. Excuse me. I want to point out, maybe for those of you who are doing research yourself or want to tap into this, there's a strong blind spot if we say, look, political and climate or environmental refugees are, that's a distinction that's arbitrary. It's also important to note that resettlement communities where you find asylum communities, where you find even environmental refugees, these may be the most vulnerable environmental justice communities that we have within the United States. So even if you're a political refugee, we can trace your life from flight of whatever it is you were fleeing to where you may be warehoused for anywhere from a year to decades. And that condition itself is a violation of anything we would consider to be a form of environmental justice, because you're displaced. Now you're in limbo, and there's not the same resources that you would find. You don't have a homeland, you're waiting for asylum, and then when you go into the new place, there's fear of moving outside of your immediate environment, your house or your work environment. And who's renting to our refugee population? And are those landlords taking advantage of the fact that these are populations that will likely never speak up to authority about things like water contamination, etc.? So there's two sides to this. One, we have climate refugees, but we also have an environmental justice crisis even within our current refugee system if we think about political refugees. So here's a concept of environmental identity that I've been working with. It's just a broad mix here, where what we think about environmental identity is it's constituting an amalgamation of cultural identities, ways of life, and self-perceptions that are connected to a given group's material environment. And by material, I mean all the matter that we're talking about, not just the built material, but every material that we're working through. And then the desire here is to think about displacement in many practitioners' language, not just refugee, but environmentally displaced, because it actually helps us to see how the environmental identity of a people or a person are being affected. If you put in environmental identity into the community and you consider it over time, then environmental heritage is the term that people have been using for this. This is not the UN convention term for environmental heritage that's used in the Heritage Convention that names World Heritage Sites. They have an environmental heritage dimension or a cultural heritage dimension. This is not that term. This is actually connecting to the environmental identity of displaced people. And here it's considering the community over time or their identity over time, where the meanings and the symbols of the past frame values, practices, and places we wish to preserve as members of a community. In other words, our environmental heritage is our identity, environmental identity, in relation to the community viewed over time. The importance of this for an environmental justice point of view is, especially in climate justice, it's not just a backward-looking point of who harmed us, who's at fault, who did all the, consumption, and how do we get back what was taken. That is often a distributive remedy, and that has to be in play. But it is really a forward-looking. What do we take from what we want of the past, what we care about, and how do we move forward with those values? How do we sustain them? And that's often used as a concept of resilience. How do we maintain ourselves and maintain our continuance? Being distributed goods may not be the way to actually maintain that identity over time. Again, so you're looking at the past, not as heritage, not as a stuck in past moment that people just linger and hold on to, but you're actually looking at what do we value about ourselves to bring forward. And if you're imagining something like maybe fossil fuels will eventually not be used for automobiles to this extent. We're hearing all sorts of countries now moving, really envisioning a much earlier date where they have to go electric. That is a presentation of an environmental heritage. We lived on fossil fuels. We are addicted to fossil fuels, and we're actually thinking, what do we want to bring forward? Not fossil fuels. We want to actually look at our past and slowly phase out. We are slowly, as a society, changing our values and what we want to bring forward. We don't want to bring the destruction forward. We know it goes with fossil fuels. Okay, so I'm going to try to bring this together for questions. I'll just leave that there. And here we're just going to walk through a couple of cases. This goes back about, to 1996, where these images started to crop out around the world, and they were the images of the shrinking Aral Sea, which was at the time when these boats were floating, which was up until about the 90s. It was the fourth largest inland sea of the world. That rivals like our Great Lakes. And the former Soviet Union and then continuing onward were tapping off the resources that were filling this inland sea. They were tapping off where the rivers that were feeding it, and then they made cotton crops where they shouldn't have made them, and then they used the sea as a kind of sink for all the toxins that were flowing out, the pesticides, etc. Over time, this sea that you can understand was a whole fishing community began receding so fast that the fisherwomen could not drag their ships to the shore. They couldn't get them to the shore fast enough, and the sea has receded. So you get this very strange image of the camels with these. But what we see in climate issues, and this was early inland sea in as early as the 90s, is that as the salt bed is exposed, all that toxic salt goes in and creates its own climate condition throughout this desert basin, the Central Asian basin. And people were finding about a ton of toxic salt per acre raining on them over the course of the year. So that's what you would have been experiencing in this pattern. And in this case, we get the kind of refugees who may not really be able to relocate, but the sea has receded so much that the folks who are the fishers are really just there trying to deal with one of the worst toxic conditions of the former Soviet Union. So the sea is what's migrated. In effect, the environmental migration was the sea receding. The people really don't have the place to move, partly because the people further away from the sea don't really like the people who have been pushed closer to the sea over the last 1,100 years or something. So, so that's what got me into this, and let me say that the argument that was made by myself and co-author Mickey Glantz from National Center for Atmospheric Research was we were trying to establish the Aral Sea as a World Heritage Site on the same grounds, but environmental grounds, as Auschwitz is a cultural World Heritage Site. So Auschwitz is, worst human disaster we can imagine. Never again, never again, never again. And the Aral Sea was the worst ecological disaster of the Cold War. Same ideas. To have an international community come together and recognize what the Cold War wrought and what the health conditions were of the people, and obviously the ecological conditions led to a whole loss of biodiversity. So then we can look forward and backward. The Marshall Islands, in case you're wondering, Marshall Islands is there. But why, oops, sorry, give it away. But why do we have it here too? Well, this is what we learned, is Marshall Islands was devastated by US nuclear testing, hydrogen bombs, atomic bombs. About 67 sites were hit, and we can see them here. These are all indications of where you would have had the atomic testing. And so these atolls, which are sort of volcanic islands that seep back into the water, are all noting these fun names like dogwood, olive, pine, fig, quince, osage. Those are all the names of each of those blasts. So they all have their own little mission, their own little attach. So guess where all the radiation is from all those bombs? They are on places that have about a foot left before they will descend into the Pacific Ocean. So there's got to be a way around it, and I won't give you the real ugly details of the people who were affected by that radiation, but they have been there since. Here's one way that we dealt with it. The US government and others did the big scrape. So on one of the most active atolls where you have radionucleotides, they scraped the surface, all the plants, all the vegetation, you stripped it all off of there. Anything you had, coconut trees, palm trees, everything must go because of its radioactivity. Now notice, we were talking about these atomic bombs during the Cold War in the 50s and 60s, and now at around 1978, they come up with a plan for disposing of this. And they put it in this crater that they then covered with cement, all of that big scrape, and it's in this place. It's on one of the atolls that would also ultimately submerge, but it doesn't matter because it's already leaking. So that's your dome. The people in the area call it the tomb, and it has no marking, has no fence, has no way of telling you not to go there. So people film it and say, look, and folks say, shouldn't you wear a mask? And people are saying, I drink the water down the other atoll. I don't think I need a mask anymore. So many have been relocated from the Marshall Islands to the United States. There are some agreements. Marshall Islands was part of the United States, had an independence, but also still has some compensation due them from the United States. So here are some people who took, along with about 20 or 15,000 Marshallese, took the opportunity to relocate. And the big relocation place for these climate refugees is Arkansas. So Marshall Islands, Arkansas. You can follow the Tyson chicken plants and you'll find the refugee communities. So this is a quote from this couple here. Can't go home, so there's no place to go back to. With a bitterness in her voice, now what am I going to do? Going home to water. And when she's homesick, she cries herself to sleep. Ferdinand distracts himself with work at the lake. Sometimes they can relax and forget. So about an hour away from their house in Arkansas, there's a lake. They can get their water connections, their environmental identity resurges. And of course it brings homesickness, what may be called solastalgia, the loss of place and the homesickness for place. But it is also where their environmental identity is. This is the climate change identity that we've invented, is the climate refugee, not just the environmental refugee, but the climate refugee. And it's not clear which one of us is going to survive out of life without being the next climate refugee. Because it's an identity we now have. It's all right there in the same breath as, what would it take to be a political refugee? It's all always just hanging right there, even if we think we can, escape it. Tuvalu is a common place that we have also considered, roughly near the Marshallese. And here also we get a kind of referencing to the transformation for environmental identity, the related to self and cultural esteem, as well as the imported other, the migrant who could eventually become the environmental burden on the residents who inherit the environmental refugees. And I want to really stress this, that we actually, and again, this is seeing this 20 years ago, it was the thing I would cringe about. It's one thing to see how you would take a despised group and locate toxic waste near them or spoil their water. But when people become the environmental burden that you don't want, which we're witnessing more and more, that becomes a resurgence of the kind of racism and the kind of despising of other groups that we're trying to step away from in social justice and environmental justice. But imagine all the people that we see in these faraway places have to go somewhere. And we enjoy the life in Oregon where we know this is one of the places everybody wants to come. So it may not be the Tuvaluans we're concerned about or the Marshallese, but it will be the other people in the United States running away from them, running towards us. There'll be a chain reaction, of course. So the people who migrate may look like everybody around in Oregon, but we already know Oregon's, attitude towards all those people coming. Don't tell anybody. We keep them out. Don't let them come here. Don't let them come and do what they did to Colorado and Boulder. Just keep them out. Well, the thing is, they have to come because they're going to run away from others. Boom. So we all in Oregon have to figure out, how will we prepare for that transition? What kind of values will we impart? What kind of heritage do you want to sustain? And how do you want to bring new people into that? Otherwise, there's an injustice that we would say, no, this is our space. We colonized it, it's ours. You guys just stay wherever you are. And this is what happened in Tuvalu, is that as people had to leave their islands, the New Zealand government was repatriating them onto New Zealand, even though the most wealthy and responsible climate crisis agent is Australia. They don't want immigrants. They don't want two balloons. They don't do this. They just don't. And New Zealand had to stop after a while as well. And it wasn't necessarily better for the two balloons who are now Kiwi. Here you say, okay, hey, where are you from? I can tell you're an islander. And the person says, what shall I say? Oh, it's disappeared or submerged into the sea because of global warming. So that's like our identity, our culture. Everything will disappear. We may get together here as a community and celebrate when it's Independence Day, our successes and things, but it's different. Definitely it's going to be really hard for us to accept that we're no longer on the map. It's no joke. And again, we're seeing these in our Arctic spaces, way up there. We know a couple of communities impacted by permafrost. Here we're finding dead bodies that have been suffering from the flu epidemics of the late 1800s are actually defrosting as they come out of the permafrost. And then there's nothing like a good old Hurricane Maria to just remind us of how we're treating our fellow countrymen under extreme environmental justice. And I want time, so I'll leave this here as these are lists of the kinds of things that happen in extreme cases of environmental justice, where even if you're making inroads to deal with the impacts, there is continued aggression, retaliation, and environmental violence violations against the victims. So if we haven't seen enough environmental violence put on the victims of the Puerto Rican climate crisis from Hurricane Maria, then we certainly see it from the fact that there's all these earthquakes that are taking out the other side of the island, while the supplies from Hurricane Maria are actually being found 2 years later. And we can't forget that people were actually saying that people are dying while others were not. This is one of my favorite stories. These guys were an environmental justice, environmental guerrilla machine, environmental education way up in the mountains and in Juntas. And that was one of the places hardest to get. You always heard about it, Juntas, you can't possibly get there. These guys were off the grid, so they were the only place with electricity. And they saved all the folks who were up in that region. They had food, they had provisions, they really came out. And they had radio. And then when we all looked at it after a while, we say, it's about 4,700 dead from that event. So that's the environmental violence that's now coming down on climate refugees and environmental refugees, because again, it's who's being impacted is already part of this resistance to make sure they don't migrate, they don't become the new environmental burden. I'll leave this here and then take your questions. So thanks a lot for your time.
All right, sounds like they're ready.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. What would be the first step in remedying what's happening on the Marshall Islands? If you had complete control, what would you do?
So great question. So one of the points that I made about distribution being a problem, and in this case, the distribution that we can consider is there are many impacts upon the Marshallese people, particularly those living closer to where detonations were in Bikini Islands. The United States ultimately did make a repatriation settlement, about $100 million, and there may be other ones that have crossed the table paying out. Now, one of the things that happened is you have a colonized set of islands that the United States, won over Japan, which was before that I think a French colonized island. So it had been a spot a hotbed of environmental colonialism for a long time. And when these settlements were paid out, there wasn't a sense of what it means to have $2,000 in your pocket. I don't know what it's like to have $2,000 in my pocket, but imagine if you don't really operate on currency practices because you operate on island shared practices. The economy wasn't the kind of place where people could be handed $10,000 and know really what to do with it. Some people were able to leave and migrate to Hawaii or to other places. Some started businesses, some tried to build it up, what we would have thought would be the best way to build it up. But the lack of colonial knowledge to build these kinds of economies meant that all that money just went out. People just lost it. They just lost it. They spent it. Or the economy fell and those who made businesses lost them. So the distribution of money and just the distribution of, let's just pay for it, doesn't work in these kinds of contexts where we would have, even in the best intentions. So we really need to I would like to know what the Marshallese need and know what they want and know where they can envision themselves if these islands are uninhabitable, which they are. Not only do I want to assist the people and to know what they should do, but that whole region will now become a nuclear waste moat. Fiji will be impacted, other Pacific islands. So what would I do? I would put the Marshallese in charge of what to do, and I would be humble about it. And I would be humble about it because people were displaced for me to be here, and we need to stop the trend of trying to battle off folks who are doing the kind of mobilization that we've been doing for a couple of hundred years. So long answer, sorry, it was ask them was the answer.
Yes.
Thank you.
That was great, thank you. I feel like most of the questions are revolving around two main issues. One is, what can we do here in Oregon to help? What can we do here in the US to help?
Good. So yeah, I thought about that, especially as we were thinking towards the last slides. The particular point that I'm still trying to get my full thinking through is the way that these migrations, we can think of ourselves far away from Arkansas, far away from Iowa, far away from the Tyson, plants or something like that. But as I say, if this is becoming the most valuable place in the world, which I think, last summer was the best weather here when I looked around the world. Everybody was either flooded in Europe or overheated, or, we kind of, just got by, no fires or minimal. And I think it's going to continue that way. We're going to have two kinds of migrations that are going to be in migrations, and we'll have to think about how to make the accommodation. But also on a broader scale, what are we as a nation obligated to do for the many people around the world who are being the most impacted and who have impacted the climate in the least way comparable. So here's one thing I would want to say, is that not only do we have in migration, we have other forms of environmental and climate refugees, and that is the thousands of species who can't migrate fast enough, who from trees trying to march northward to insects dying off. So we have to think more in the non-anthropocentric combined with the anthropocentric. What do we need for human environmental justice? And the environment is all the material conditions surrounding them. So how do we do justice to biodiversity? Those are the other refugees that are, we're losing. So what I like about Oregon these days is that things like rivers are gaining rights in human context. It's full of great progressive environmental values. There's a lot of food, farm to table type of thing. And what I would suggest is, as someone, as I mentioned, maybe someone asked this, make this transition period one where we try to find people who are people of color and who are people from different economic backgrounds leading the environmental movement, so that we are able to talk to people differently from different places in the world, and also ensure that it's a place of racial justice and it's a place of economic justice. But most of all, the environmental justice is, what environmental values do you want to instill here for the future of Oregonians, regardless of who they may be as they migrate in? If we hold them as environmental burdens, people who shouldn't be coming into this place, we're doing a lot of what we're seeing as the horrors of how refugees, climate refugees, and displaced people are feeling. They may be displaced affluent people, you'll have to deal with that. But still, displaced affluent people will come to your lands, and you can educate those folks on the kind of environmental values you want as a heritage here in Oregon. And again, it won't necessarily be burdenous people if you can instill practices that are better than fence sitting, complacency, or resisting and rejecting people to land that may not be our own. So at the U.S. level, we've obviously dropped our asylum cases and asylum arrivals. I've had the opportunity to work with different experts and connections in refugee communities and resettlement communities, and it's really quite astounding that we just sort of shut that door. And again, these are connected. If you're shutting the door on climate science and climate impacts and people around the world, it's hard to figure out, what would the first step that the U.S. do? Sort of go back 5 steps and restart, because we're on the wrong path. But it's not a path that's too far from where we should be. I think we still have it in sight. Thanks.
And the second question that really a lot of these questions revolve around is the governance issue, mostly at the international scale. What kind of legislation or policy would you like to see, or are there any success stories?
Yeah, so I think that the challenge of maintaining environmental heritage and the challenge of having new environmental identities thrust upon us, especially ones we don't want, like being a climate refugee or being the burden on other peoples. There's always this downside to what are the better stories. So first of all, in terms of resettlement communities, the containment that refugees have in their new communities, we saw some of the comments, people really often don't want to go beyond the very local area. So I knew people in Denver who were there for 9 years and never went to the mountains. There's that kind of thing happening. So if I were to think about it in terms of environmental identity, it's obviously been stripped in some way from the refugees who resettle here or anywhere, in the sense that they left their place and they have to remake it. And we don't encourage environmental consideration of any type in our political refugee system. It's durable goods. It's either you return back or you stay. You get a job, you get a place to live, and that's what happens. And you do that as fast as you possibly can in order to stay on the track of asylum. That's it. There's nothing about your environmental quality. As I said, you may be the most vulnerable residents that there are in the United States. But we can also think about it as, well, what would it look like if you encourage a rebuilding of one's environmental identity? It was stripped away, but what would it look like? And so rather than having classes to teach English as a second language in the basement in some place, the class goes to a farm. And you just do the same class there, but now you're talking about different things instead of what's on the board. You're talking about, people will ask you, what kind of trees are these? Do you have snakes here? We had snakes where I lived, right? And that might be 15 years before they were in a refugee camp. And now they're starting to recall and recover the environmental identity, not just that they had to flee from, but the one that they couldn't expose themselves to because that would be such a loss. But now they're in a place where they can connect it to. The community gardens that have started in different resettlement areas have been tremendous. They obviously bring people back to their staple foods and their staple goods that they also remember. Some of them remember that they were farmers or grandchildren of farmers. They haven't had the opportunity to unlock any of that experience. And some of them can obviously bring in new ideas too. Any of us working with environmental issues and environmental problems. Look at the experiences that refugees have had to overcome and the environmental conditions they may have had to flee from or survive over their time. That may actually be the model we need to see how we need to be resilient under the faces of terror that climate change is bringing. So what will we be fleeing from? Either ourselves or solutions that maybe other people have because of their experiences.
Well, thank you so much, Robert
Thank you.
Figueroa, and we'll be going over to Rogue for a little while to answer questions.